we're all global citizens. There's no gap between youth and adult. We actually have enough passion and we have the motivation.
There is no more legitimate voice about the future than the people who are going to live in it.
My name's Yolanda. I'm doing my PhD in climate change communication based in Australia.
My name is Catherine and I'm a climate scientist.
I would consider myself a change maker, a sustainable activist, a young leader.
I'm Mary Robinson, currently chair of the Elders, the group that Nelson Mandela brought together.
I am an inventor and a United Nations Young Leader for the Sustainable Development Goals.
My name is Fatih Birhul. I am the head of the International Energy Agency.
I'm a climate advocate and a sustainability enthusiast.
I am Dr. Vanessa Carey. I am the World Health Organization Special Envoy for Climate Change and Health.
I'm a gender and climate justice advocate from Brazil, and I'm really passionate about including intersectionality and climate justice into the negotiations, everything we do for a better future.
Deirdre, it's great to meet you. Do you want to sort of tell us a little bit about your background and what you've been doing, particularly in the climate space?
Growing up in a small island developing state, just in my lifetime alone, I've seen the impacts of climate change firsthand. So from a very young age, I've felt compelled to be involved and be vocal about this. My background is in STEM. I'm a chemical and process engineer, but I try to work specifically on carbon abatement and decarbonization projects.
Yeah, my latest project, Climate Words, it exists to increase climate literacy and to give people the tools they need to talk about climate. So we invite authors, scientists, indigenous leaders, policymakers, anyone who's an expert to define a word that is central to their work and define it in their own voice.
As a UNICEF Youth Ambassador, I work to create an international children's rights and youth advocacy campaign that garnered over 450 million youth to take global online action in pursuit of advocating for what they believe is the greatest challenge facing our generation.
I am the youngest to ever do a PhD in Samoa. And in a way it does break a lot of barriers and mindsets for other young people to not just stop at a bachelor's or a master's. Like, you can do a PhD and you can come back and work.
I started a social enterprise called Sustainable 7 to 8 years ago. And the idea was to galvanize community and youth to tackle conservation issues, specifically marine conservation issues. I'm a scuba diver, and diving in Southeast Asia, I've kind of realized that, we do struggle with a lot of ocean-related issues, like plastic pollution, coral bleaching, fish bombing, lots of biodiversity issues. And for Sustainable, the purpose is really for us to look at how we can support coastal communities, and especially the youth who may not be as privileged or have access to education, capability, and knowledge in this region.
I'm originally coming from North Macedonia, so inspired by the toxic air pollution in the capital city and the death of my aunt, I started a non-profit organization that helps people reduce CO2 emissions from day-to-day activities.
After 7 years of picking up plastic and picking up the data of like what we were collecting, we presented that to Congress in Peru, and they then created a law to ban single-use plastic bags and single-use plastic straws. I saw how, as young people, as civil society, we could work with the government and generate major change.
I think it would be very interesting to hear your own direct experiences of climate change and its impacts.
Because of, high temperatures and as well as low precipitation, agriculture is hasn't been very fruitful. And now this is actually forcing people to move from the rural areas to come into the urban areas, but even risk their life through the Mediterranean Sea to get to the Europes and the Americas. I have relatives who have traveled through the Mediterranean Sea and lost their lives.
Every year we had floods, and occasionally we had hurricanes, and this impacted our community, especially the young kids that didn't have anything to eat. So there was an increase of malnutrition. That experience in my life has pushed me to work to face climate change, because every year I see the impact in my communities and it's getting worse and worse.
Living in a favela, the living conditions sometimes are very difficult. Recently, some of my relatives lost their homes in a landslide. Because of climate change, there are levels of rainfall that we have never seen before, and droughts that are so long, and the soil just can't take it. And more, I see this happening in Brazil, this happening with my community.
I see so many people in my country this summer losing their homes from floods or losing their lives from wildfires, and I think that adapting in this whole new reality will be one of the greatest challenges. And it's not only the practical stuff that we should take into account, it's also the mental burden that we have as a generation.
Growing up, I used to wake up quite early to have to go to school, and I would see just above the mountains, just a thick layer of smog during winter. It came to me that this is not just a natural occurrence, this is in fact also pollutants coming from the factories. The realization that the textile industry is polluting the environment, that was maybe my catalyst into the environmental space.
The climate crisis is a health crisis. It just doesn't get more fundamental than that. And health is how we feel and understand, I think, at a really personal level, what the climate crisis is doing. And I think what people don't realize is that the way the climate crisis impacts the health crisis actually has an impact on other sectors, right? It's impacting whether, if you get sick, it's a difference between whether your household lives above or below the poverty line. It has impacts on migration, on women and children who disproportionately suffer. And we know that countries that are already vulnerable and are the least contributing to climate change are those that are feeling the impacts the most currently.
In all our communities as indigenous peoples, everyone have someone that lost their home. From the desert advancing, from the drought, from the floods, from the sea level rising, what are we waiting for?
What do you see as the biggest barriers and obstacles to taking fast enough action on climate change?
There are a lot of solutions are on the table, but a lot of times it takes so much time to create those decisions that when they come to being implemented, the time in which they are implemented really changes the way that it gets implemented. So I think if it's implemented at the right time, most of the solutions can turn out to be very, very successful. And even if not successful, you can really understand what went wrong because the situation in which the solution was built and it is implemented is the same.
Seems to me that one of the biggest challenges we face is what you might call a crisis of perception across Western societies in particular, where, over centuries, not even decades, we've become progressively more distant from the natural world, and we become increasingly unaware of the extent to which our entire civilization depends upon healthy natural systems.
A lot of times, folks, especially as they come into positions of privilege, lose sight of these fundamental values of, being empathetic, having moral values, or a commitment to transparency, because they're often forced to prioritize their interests for their stakeholders or their financiers over essentially their constituents or the people on the planet.
We will not solve the climate crisis unless we put people at the center, not just for our developmental policies within our countries or within our cities or within our villages, but also internationally, that we often have this dissociation between high politics at an international level and fractious negotiations, where we forget what are we even at the table for and who are we claiming to represent.
I do think governments should be held more accountable for their commitments. I think there should be greater transparency in their reporting and their targets, their progress to these targets as well, because for years, 2015 and the Paris Agreement, that's a long time has passed since then. What actual concrete action has been taken?
If we really want to operate within a safe and just space, which we all collectively have a responsibility to move toward, then there will be, per necessity, a transition of access to carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, water, land, biodiversity that has to be made more, let's say, accessible for the vulnerable and poor, while the rich minority has to change behavior.
In Mexico, we have a very huge challenge. I don't see that the people, regular people on the street, are aware of the climate crisis. It's very disturbing because the country is very, very vulnerable to climate change. And so at the same time, people are not aware. We are not seeing any efforts to educate.
I mean, it scares me sometimes that many of the people that are talking about equity and just transition do not seem to have a clue of that, you know, what it means for people who, you know, are wrestling with poverty on a daily basis.
We need people to change their behavior in all of the roles that they play. So in their homes, in their workplaces, in communities, we need people to do things differently to what they've been doing in the past. And we need more wider kind of social cultural change, actually. We need to change our relationship with things, with consumption and with the natural environment.
Without fixing the problem in the energy sector, we have no chance whatsoever to reach our climate goals.
When governments tell us we should be turning off the lights, it ignores the fact that they're still funding new oil and gas projects, right? So I think where we see action on a larger scale and where structural barriers to individual existence are removed, I think that would be really helpful.
A big part of our problems with climate change have to do with, you know, systemic problems and corruption and decisions that are made at the highest levels that prevent us from making the change that we need.
I feel like young people always get that attribute that we're hopeful and that we're optimistic, and, you know, that it's also kind of up to us to save us out of this climate emergency. I still feel afraid quite often because we see that no matter what action we take, it just doesn't seem to be enough.
So I think there's an extraordinary opportunity to educate, to have people understand the urgency of what we're facing and how our health is being impacted and what that is doing to undermine the fabric of our societies and our world, to drive inequity and to really destabilize our future, because we are fundamentally fighting for our survival right now.
I'm currently going through some form of training to become a negotiator and understanding this process. And it's from my first encounter with it at the SBs, it's such a complicated process. And I guess my question is, like, is the negotiation process currently effective?
I have been one of the few people to attend all 27 conferences of parties of the UN Framework Convention. And the short answer to your question is no, it's not effective. The longer answer is it's the only game we have. There is no alternative. There's no global president of planet Earth who can make decisions. There's 200 presidents and prime ministers who have to come together to make a global decision.
COPs are huge mastodont undertakings. At COP, every single country of the world needs to agree on a certain way forward before it's actually taken up in kind of the decision text of the COP. So understandably, that is extremely slow.
But don't you think that all of this would go way faster if we wouldn't allow those huge companies to sponsor the COP? For many of the countries that are most affected by climate change, they don't have the financial capacities to protect themselves from the consequences of climate change. And this, once again, is connected to those huge corporations that exploit their resources and the people who work there.
Every little bit of warming matters, and the COP process has been effective in beginning to lower the threshold that we can limit warming to. But is the COP process sufficient? No, it is not sufficient. Why not? Because it doesn't involve many of the actors who have to make the decisions, especially large multinational corporations.
The bulk of decisions has been taken at the multilateral level. Where the responsibility has now shifted is to governments to implement those multilateral decisions at home.
COP isn't binding. There's no, we've seen some countries ratchet down their contributions as well as up, and even those countries that say they're going to do more often don't actually do the things that they commit to at COP.
In the initial COPs, the entire focus of the civil society and all of us was on making sure that governments delivered. And now the focus when I go to COPs is, we're all in it, we come there, we do our own little things, and governments get a free pass.
What we need is a United Nations Security Council for climate change and biodiversity. And on that Security Council, yes, we need some leading countries and we need least developed countries represented, but we also need a seat at the table for the youth. We need a seat at the table for the indigenous people. If you can create a smaller group that is responsible to the bigger communities, we have a chance of succeeding.
The loss and damage get adopted at the COP27. But the operationalizations must happen at the COP28. We are talking about the funding mechanism. We are still doing a blocks between developed countries because they think they are going to put the money, and developing countries who say we wanted to be there. It is shameful.
This needs to be the COP of the just transition, because we have to have a discussion about what the future is for these economies and where people will work. And if we can point to a more positive future without petrostates having to use fossil fuels as the basis of that economy, then I think we could really make some progress at this COP. So I always go into COP feeling optimistic, but that's my note of optimism this year.
How would you like to raise the profile of the work that the youth of the world are capable of doing and pulling that youth movement together so that you can have the impact that is needed?
Because I always try to emphasize capacity building, because as young people, we cannot be able to achieve whatsoever we want to achieve in our fight against climate change if we are not on top of things. So we need to be giving that chance to be able to learn about climate change issues so that we are also able to help our communities to be resilient to climate change.
Part of this fund, loss and damage, or also the developed nations, the rich nations should start developing top-level universities all over the world, technological institutes that would really start forming, doing capacity development of thousands of young students like yourself for really facing the climate change challenges.
Education is just seen as something very elitist, something for white people, something for rich people. The first time I had the opportunity to apply for a scholarship at a private school, I was 11 years old. I had to wake up at 4 a.m. every day to go to school. People pointed guns on my head, going through very violent places to be able to get what for other people is just so simple.
Listening to youth is not enough. Insights from the young leaders must be utilized to transform policies and programs. Without any tangible actions, you realize that youth may have few seats at the table, but those seats have no real meaning.
It's important to have young people's voices in terms of helping set the ambition, but it's also really important to have young people's voices in the room where actions are being scrutinized as well.
This isn't just about having people at the table, it's also about ensuring that we have that diverse selection of youth. So conducting surveys, ensuring that youth have a space to talk, and ensuring that people actually have that follow up and follow through from our leaders where we see that the ideas that we want are actually implemented.
We should have a lobby that pushes for more youth inclusion at all levels. If you're not in the table, you are part of the menu.
If we think about year 2100,
which is until when many of the projections are targeted. I won't see year 2100, but many people alive now, like young people, will. And since it's the future of young people, so I think it's essential that the young people also have a say in what happens.
Young people, they've understood. They've followed the knowledge, they recognize the facts, and are much more in line with the state of evidence than my generation and an elder.
I believe that young voices need to be not only at the table, but officially and in numbers at the table, as delegates, as participants whose voices matter.
Given the diversity of young people and our ability to organize and collaborate across different geographies is a very powerful thing, and it fosters a lot of new ideas and thinking and cross-learning.
Young people, yes, will look at issues quite differently, in my experience. They will come up with new ideas and things that haven't been tried, but also really importantly, they won't be kind of so jaded at the idea of trying something again that perhaps is tried in the past.
My advice to young people is don't wait to be invited. Always be there to assert your own space. You have the wisdom, you have the perspective, you have the connectedness, and I think you have the passion that will truly allow us to expose the cracks in the system. I have big hopes for the youth.
What gives you hope to continue in this fight?
What gives me hope is when I see people acting together. Representatives from all across civil society are all coming together to recognize that the climate crisis, to care about the climate crisis, you don't have to be a scientist, you don't have to be an environmentalist, you don't have to be an activist, you only have to be a human being living on planet Earth. And if you're that, then you have everything that you need to care about this issue and to advocate for a better future for all of us.
There is this international movement of indigenous peoples that for more than 100 years, we have been struggling to make our voice heard at the different international level. And now I see conservation organizations, environmentalist organizations, they are more open to really listen to our messages and join hands.
If you have a look at some of what has been happening more recently, look at the clean energy transition. I think there are estimates that by 2025, there'll be more electricity globally produced from renewables than other sources. There are things happening, it's just a question of pace. But that is why it is really vitally important that you and your generation continue to hold very vocally governments to account and business to account. So please keep doing what you're doing.
One of the most powerful levers that young people have as they enter the workforce is to ask awkward questions of potential employers.
Right.
And you never know when you're the one that just triggers the boardroom conversation and says, you know what, we had another brilliant young engineer turn us down this week, and I think it's because we didn't have a good answer to the question, what are you doing about climate change?
When I attended my first COP back in Paris, it was for the Paris Agreement COP21. There were about 20 to 30 maximum youth from Brazil that attended in our delegation. And nowadays, the last COP, COP27 in Egypt that we attended, there was over 300-400 youth. A lot of them were Black youth from peripheries of all over the world, but including, of course, in Brazil, in the favelas, and also indigenous young people that are kind of reclaiming now their power into these spaces, accessing those spaces. So it gives me so much hope and strength to continue in this fight, to see that these spaces are opening up, that people are willing to collaborate, that people understand the seriousness and the big challenge that we have as a community, as a planet.
I think one thing that really gives me hope is the fact that young people, aside from being activists, they are trying to engage in the boardrooms, they are scientists, they are entrepreneurs, they're really, going across all of these different sectors and industries and working to create such impact within. And I think that's something that I try and learn from my peers all the time.
I find hope in the actions of youth, that we are brave enough to take governments to task. There's so many interesting cases of climate litigation that have been youth-led this year. Youth groups taking governments to court, taking big polluters to court. And that is the inspiration that really keeps me going. It's just the fact that there's nothing to be afraid of. There's only so much to gain, and we simply need to work together, learn from each other. From across regions, there's far more that unites us than that which divides us. Thank you.